In this lesson, we're going to learn how to create prefabs. All right, so now that we have our assets imported into our project browser, we want to start taking those assets and making them into game objects inside of Unity. Now, you might be wondering, what is a prefab? A prefab is a stored collection containing one or more complete game objects with components that are attached, and there are properties that are set. So, what does that look like exactly? Well, let's use an example here. Let's go to our meshes folder, and we're going to go to environment, and inside of our environment folder we're going to take the rock_L and we're going to drop that into the scene. Now, anytime that you bring in assets, you'll want to move them around or manipulate them using their position, rotation, or scale. This is pretty simple. If you're used to 3D, you'll know how to use this, but I want to just throw a little bit of a quick snippet in here about moving them around. So let's hit W to grab our move tool, which is already activated. We'll hit E to grab our rotation tool, and then R for scale. So it's pretty self-explanatory on how to use each one of those. Hitting W will bring up your move tool, and you can move it along the corresponding handle that you've grabbed there. You could also transform an object right here using its transform component. So let's go ahead and position it at 0 on the X, 0 on the Z, and then we're going to take our Y value, we're going to bring that up until the rock is sitting right on top of that grid. So let's set this to 9. All right, so there we have our rock in the scene. Now this rock, it doesn't have a material, it doesn't have a collider, and it might need some other components to give it the behavior that we want. So how do we add a component to a game object? Well, we can do it a couple of different ways. The first way is to simply left click on the add component right here in the inspector, and this will bring up a list of different components that you can add. So we have categories first. So if we want to add a collider, we're going to go to the physics category. So once we click on that, it's going to reveal everything that's in the physics category, and we can start to go down through that list. Now, it's not a very big list, but part of it is off screen for us, and I apologize for that. But here you can see the colliders. Now, there are a couple of different colliders that you could use. You have these 3D colliders, but then you also have the 2D colliders. Anytime that you're working with 3D colliders, more often than not, you will use 3D colliders. Okay. If you're working with 2D objects, you'll use 2D colliders. Okay. So let's go to physics, and let's use a box collider. So you can see the box collider has been attached, and it shows up as a green box around the bounds of the object. And so it resizes it, it centers it for us, really nice and neat. Now there's one problem with this box collider. It may not be the behavior that we want for our game. So what would happen? The player would come running up to this wall, and let's say they want to check out the texture, and then they could only get so far because the bounding box or the collider is preventing them from getting any closer to the edge. And so we may want a collider that shrink wraps a little bit closer to the shape of the object itself. Now we could use a different collider. Let's go ahead and remove this box collider. Let's left click and let's remove that component. Instead of using the add component here, let's go up to the top and use component here. It's the exact same thing, it's just a different way of adding a component. So let's go to physics, and then we're going to go to mesh collider. Now when we apply a mesh collider component, this works a little bit differently. We don't see that green bounding box. Why is that? It's because it's using the game mesh as its collider. So it's perfectly aligned to the game mesh itself. Now you don't ever want to do this unless you specifically have to. Now you might be asking, why don't we want to do that? What's the problem with this? The problem with doing this is that you are essentially doubling the vertex count in memory. So this mesh right here, if we select it, let's see if we can get some information about it. If we select this mesh, okay, go ahead and expand that out. You'll see that there are 2,332 vertices on this mesh. if you add the collider to this, you are doubling that. So it's 4,664 vertices in that. That can be an issue. So what do we do instead? How do we reduce that footprint in memory? Well, let's select our game object and let's add a different mesh as the collider. In this case, I'm actually going to use the rock_L_A_collider, COL. Notice how it has 184 vertices. Much, much different. Less of a footprint. Okay, this is proper game asset creation. Now, if you want to learn more about game asset creation in Unity and its pipeline, I suggest that you check out this course right here. This course is the game asset pipeline for Unity. So you can learn the full pipeline for creating game assets at a basic level. You'll kind of get an idea of some of the different tools that you will use, like ZBrush, and some quick tips and tricks on what to do whenever you're wanting to create game assets for Unity itself. All right, so now we have this set up. It's a mesh collider. We have the proper mesh for the collider on there. And now what we want to do is we want to make it into a prefab. So how do we do that? It's very simple. Let's go ahead and go to our assets folder. Let's right click and create a new folder, and we're going to call this prefabs and hit enter. Now in the prefabs folder, if you double click on that, all you have to do is left click on the object that you want to create a prefab and drag that into your prefabs folder. Now, it doesn't matter if it's a prefabs folder itself. It can be any folder. If you drag it from the hierarchy into any folder, it will create it as a prefab. Now, how do we know that it's a prefab? Well, if we select the object that we created that prefab for, you'll see that we now have this prefab parameter. And we have three buttons. We have select, revert, and apply. This is a very powerful tool. Prefabs are very important. So select obviously is going to select the main object in the project browser that this is instanced from. If we hit revert, what it will do is it will erase any changes that we've made to this that are different from what's in the project browser. And if we hit apply, it will apply any changes that we've made to this to the object in the content or in the project browser. So what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, let's go ahead and take this and let's remove the component. Let's add that box collider again. And let's say that we realize, well, that's not going to work for us. So let me hit revert. Notice how it goes back to what the state is here. Okay. Now, if I were to come in and remove that component, and then I added in the box collider again, but this time if I hit apply, it's going to keep the changes that we've made in the scene and apply that to what's in the project browser. So watch this. If I drag and drop this into my scene, notice that this one now has that box collider. It no longer has the mesh collider. So now I have two of these in my scene. And now at this point I've got these in my scene and I've started staggering them and creating this little rock wall. And I realize that I have a problem. I've created this box collider and I really needed it to be a mesh collider. What I can do now is I can come in and just say, all right, let's remove this component. Let's add the mesh collider back to that. And we're going to use the mesh or the rock large collider. And then now what I want to do is I want that to apply to all of the rocks that I have in my scene. If I just hit apply, you'll now notice that it has changed every other object just like it. Okay, this is a very powerful workflow. Use prefabs as often as you can because you can make changes very, very quickly. And if at any time you decide that your asset, there might be something wrong with it or you need to make a change, you can always double click on the main object right here inside of your project browser and it will bring up the default software for that file type. So for FBX on my computer, the default is set up for 3ds Max. So if I were to double click on this, it would bring up 3ds Max, allow me to make my changes, and then I can re-export that out and it will update that very quickly. So now that we've talked about how to create prefabs, let's continue with this workflow, and I want to show you how to create a material, and then we can apply that to the rest of our prefabs, and we'll get started with that next.